I want to start off by taking you way back to January 10th, 1980. Do you remember what you were doing that day? Were you even born then? That's the day my family arrived in Canada. You see, we were members of the Baha'i faith, a religious minority in Iran that was persecuted. But we were lucky. Canada offered us citizenship, something I'll always be grateful to Canada for. When we arrived at our local town, the newspaper even featured us. That picture is of me as a small child. When I arrived at school, most of the kids were really friendly, but then a few characters came up to me and said, "Go free the hostages in Iran." Okay, first of all, it's not Iran, it's Iran, but not a big deal, I let that one go. But did these kids think I could free the hostages? I was a child after all, not a good starting point. And this is way before the internet, so I couldn't even reach the decision makers if I wanted to. But I think what they were really trying to say is, you don't belong. You're not one of us. It's the same feeling a lot of immigrants get. They feel rejected by their old country and they're not fully embraced by their new country, right? I'm sure some of you experienced that. Exclusion, hate, and prejudice, of course, are not new. What's new, however, is that much of this has now gone online. Increasingly online, we're seeing a lot of acts of violence also tied to this hate. For example, in 2017, we saw hundreds of thousands of people ethnically cleansed in Myanmar because of communication that was going on Facebook beforehand. In Christchurch, New Zealand, where I used to be a professor, we saw Muslims gunned down at 2 mosques. Over 50 Muslims were killed. In the United States, of course, we've seen a number of these as well, a number of acts of hate-driven violence against particular ethnic groups. We saw African Americans killed in a church in Charleston, South Carolina. We saw Jews killed in a synagogue in Pittsburgh. We saw Hispanics killed in El Paso, Texas, and recently we saw Asian Americans targeted in Atlanta, right? So we've seen these across many parts of the country, targeting many different groups. But what can we do about hate when we see it online? That's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about 5 lessons from academic research that you can use yourself when you see hate online that can potentially help reduce that hate. Now, when we talk about hate speech, we have to realize that the most dangerous kind of hate speech is against groups of people. Here, an entire group is cast as a negative stereotype. And if you can successfully do this, then everyone in that group is responsible for the negative acts of one, and they're all somehow at fault, right? The entire group becomes blamed. So when you see this online, when you see negative stereotypes online, what you can do is try to break that up. What you're doing when you kind of collectivize people in a negative whole is you kind of dehumanize them, right? They become a collective mass and not individuals anymore. So what you can do is to individualize them again and talk about individuals in positive ways from that group, right? So you take collective negative stereotypes and you talk about individuals in a positive light. That's the first lesson that you could try if you see it online. The second lesson has to do with contradictory positions that people often have, right? Sometimes people have very positive views of their own group and very negative views of another group, right? And so somehow they're kind of holding a double standard. And you can tap into that in your communication with people to try to unpack prejudice. Let me talk about one study that's really interesting in this regard. People were asked, should Muslims be collectively blamed for the terrorist act of a particular Muslim? A number of people said yes. Then they were put in scenarios where they were presented with an act of terrorism by a Christian. And they were asked, should Christians be blamed? And many of those people said, no, of course not. My group can't be blamed for the act of an individual. That's just a crazy person, right? And then they were asked again, should Muslims be blamed for the collective actions, the negative actions of an individual collectively? Some of those people that said yes the first time then said no, because they realized they had this kind of double standard, this hypocritical position. And what was likely going on there is that they had cognitive dissonance, right? They had this kind of contradiction going on in their mind. And so to alleviate that, they had to shift their position to have cognitive consistency. People like to have cognitive consistency. So you can tap into that to challenge a lot of hate and prejudice, which really is irrational if you actually dig down into it. So that's lesson number 2. Lesson number 3, when you communicate with people, try to be credible. And to be credible, that means you often don't come from your own point of view, but you try to tap into people that are held in high regard by the group you're trying to influence, right? And this might be past statements by a leader, but it could also be special texts that they hold in high regard. Maybe a constitution, a holy book. There are many lofty statements in these kinds of texts. And if you can tap into those, you're more likely to convince people that might come from a different point of view than just talking about it directly yourself. So try that. Try to come across with credibility. That's lesson number 3. Lesson number 4, when you see hate online, what you often want to do is call that person a hater or a racist, right? But try to avoid this temptation because this is often counterproductive. Try to engage in constructive dialogue. And what you can do is ask some questions. Why do you say what you're saying? What are you hoping to achieve? Did you know that what you're saying could actually lead to people getting hurt? What kind of world do you want to leave for your children? These kinds of questions unpack people's motivations. And interesting, it helps them open up, but it also helps you understand them better. What you often realize is these people aren't just haters, but they're coming from a position of trying to protect their in-group. And then by doing that, sometimes they're saying very hateful things about those who think might threaten their in-group or their way of life, right? And if you try to kind of get into conversations about these at this level kind of motivation, then you can often find common ground. One quote that's really wonderful from Martin Luther King talks about this. It says, "Darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that." So remember that next time you're about to respond to someone who says a hateful comment. Try to engage with them in a positive, constructive way. Lesson number 4. Now, lesson number 5 brings together all 4 of these lessons and applies them to an online forum. So when you're in an online forum when there's hate, there's often people that have other people supporting them. So what you can do by going in there and challenging this in a respectful way is to essentially try to change the online norm. What's acceptable and unacceptable online in that forum. And by trying to change the online norm, you can get other people to join you as well who might be standing back and watching. Others might have like-minded views as yours, but they may be reluctant to get in. But when they see you step in, they will also get in. And this creates a kind of herding effect where others will join, and over time you can change the online norm. And another effect this can have is that it can make those who are espousing hate step back, right? There's this other idea called the spiral of silence, which is how people feel when they have unpopular views. They usually don't want to espouse them because of the social isolation they encounter. So that can happen online as well. People, if they see a lot of people challenging their hateful views, will often step back and not engage. And then you can start to change the norms in that forum. And the most important people that you can affect are actually those who are vulnerable. Those who have certain grievances that are similar to those that are espousing hate, but they haven't committed to a hateful ideology yet. So you can try to influence those people. And some of those people are young, impressionable youth. And if you can get them before they establish their positions, then you can move them in the direction away from hate. Okay, let's recap those 5 lessons. Do you remember what they are? Lesson number 1, reframe the argument. Remember, dehumanization involves negative collectivization. Rehumanization involves positive individualization. Lesson number 2, challenge hypocrisy, which is often irrational, by challenging how people view their group with other groups. This can help drop collective blame. Lesson number 3, communicate with credibility. Lesson number 4, be nice, engage in constructive dialogue. And lesson number 5, work with others to change the online norm away from hate. En route to a better world, overcoming hate and prejudice will be one of the greatest challenges of this century. However, with online tools, they also bring a lot of opportunities that we can tap into. Remember this, because we ultimately have to share this one planet, and it's increasingly important not to see the world as us and them, but to see us all as one human family. Thank you very much for listening.